Well, welcome and thank you for joining us with the United States Naval Academy's Alumni Association Foundation's Call to Serve Speaker Series. We have Captain Wendy Lawrence, class of '81, and Lieutenant Commander Caleb Barron, class of 2010. My name is Jimmy DeButts. I'm shipmate editor. I'm editor of Shipmate Magazine, excuse me.
And hi, I'm Dr. Sophie Loomis, the Alumni Engagement Outreach Senior Director. Our program will be about an hour long, and it'll be a great conversation between Captain Lawrence and Lieutenant Commander Barron, followed by some questions.
We have our CEO, Jeff Webb, class of 1995. If Jeff, you want to make some opening remarks?
Yes, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's a very special privilege to hear from two of our 54 Naval Academy graduates who become astronauts. We began with Alan Shepard, class of 1945, who was the first U.S. astronaut aboard Mercury Redstone 3. Five of our astronauts have also become distinguished graduates, including one this evening. They're an accomplished and special group of people. The first woman graduate to be selected by NASA as an astronaut is our moderator tonight. She's also one of the 5 DGAs I just referenced, and that's Captain Wendy Lawrence, class of 1981. Captain Lawrence has logged over 1,200 hours in space during her 4 space flights. She has more than 1,500 hours of flight time in 6 different types of helicopters and has more than 800 shipboard landings. Our featured guest is Lieutenant Commander Caleb Barron, class of 2010, who just made her first launch to space aboard NASA's SpaceX Crew 3 to the International Space Station. You may have seen her on the cover of the April Shipmate wearing her Navy colors. And Jimmy, our shipmate editor here, considers it our best cover photo ever, and I think he's got a pretty good case for that. Commander Barron spent 177 days in orbit, and she returned to Earth in May. She was also a member of the first class of women commissioned into the submarine community when she was commissioned in 2010. I'm not sure there's any job out there that's held in higher respect than that of an astronaut. Countless children dream about being an astronaut, so you two actually did it. So I want to thank you for your service, and thank you for your inspiration, and thank you for your time. Captain Lawrence, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. And I'm going to speak on behalf of Kayla and myself, because I'm sure Kayla has similar thoughts. We owe a lot to the Naval Academy. We got a great education there, some amazing opportunities afforded to us, although probably more for Kayla since the program has gotten so much better since when I was there many decades ago, and also to the Navy for some phenomenal opportunities. So we were honored to follow in the footsteps of the other Naval Academy grads who were also able to go up in space, and we both will tell you it was a very, very fun job. So with that, Kayla, congratulations. When we set this date, I didn't realize it was going to be the first anniversary of your launch. So no doubt that brings back some fun memories for you today, and I hope we get to touch on many of them. That said, I feel like I got to lead with this question. First view out the window of Earth from space. What comes to mind? What are your memories from that moment?
We had about 24 hours in orbit in our Dragon before arriving at the space station. So we actually got a good amount of time just to enjoy the view out the window, because there wasn't a lot of jobs for us to do during pre-flight. SpaceX was controlling the vehicle primarily from the ground. And so we really enjoyed the incredible views. And I think the most memorable one was we actually had a sleep period because we needed to rest between launch and docking operations. And so we had all been asleep and we're waking up on this pretty tight timeline to get ready for docking, which included eating and getting in our suits. And as we were working on suiting up, Raja looked out the window and we were at this beautiful part in our orbit where we were still in eclipse, so over the dark part of the Earth. But the space station, you know, we're catching up to it. It was in the higher orbit than us, a little bit higher altitude. And it was high enough, and the sun was at this perfect angle that it was lighting up the space station. And it was in the perfect silhouette with the solar arrays straight up and down, just like your model behind you of the space station, but just the textbook silhouette of the space station glowing gold. just shining like a diamond in the sky. And it just took our breath away, this view, because, you know, it's just this culmination of all the work we had done as a crew, and just this like romantic space moment of on your way to this amazing destination and getting a view of it out the window that was just so gorgeous. I think I'll never forget. I just have such a vivid memory of that moment. And I think for all of us, it was just like, we're really going to the space station. So yeah, that was a beautiful moment for our entire crew.
Yeah, that's one of those moments where you think, okay, we're not in the simulator anymore.
I know, exactly. And we actually kind of felt that way during launch, that, you know, we're so well prepared and so well trained for that moment, from everything to listening to recordings of what the rocket and the systems on the vehicle would sound like, to centrifuge training, understanding the forces we'd expect on our body, all of these things. And so the launch was so smooth and everything went so according to plan that until we were like in microgravity floating around, you could have just tricked us and say, just kidding, like you're in the simulator the whole time. So those views are super important for driving home this feeling that, look, we're actually finally on our way to the station.
Yeah, very much so. For me, we were a nighttime launch, similar to you. We launched at 1:30 in the morning out of Florida, and due east trajectory, so not a high inclination flight like you get to have when you're doing a station flight. And shortly, I was up on the flight deck. I was the flight engineer, so sitting behind the commander. My commander was Steve Oswald, class of 1973. So nice to have 2 Naval Academy grads on that flight. And I think basically we had to be over the Pacific Ocean, because we just got up on orbit. We got kind of settled in, realized we didn't have to do an immediate burn, what we called OMS 1 burn. We had a good launch, so we could wait 45 minutes for the second burn. And Oz literally grabbed me by my helmet ring and threw me into his window and said, "Here, your first view of Earth, take a look." And we were out over the Pacific. The sun was shining. The sun glint off the water was amazing. And I think that was the moment it really hit me. It was like, oh my gosh, I've been waiting 25 years. I've had this dream for 25 years, and I'm finally here. And it's incredible. And I briefly thought to myself, if I don't get to look out the window again during the flight, that's okay, because this one view has made all that hard work worth it. And it was probably appropriate I thought that, because then Oz grabbed me and said, okay, enough. It's time to go to work. It's just like, okay. I guess that's why we're here.
That story just gives me goosebumps, because it's just so relatable to our experience too. And one thing that was cool about our crew is we had 3 rookies and 1 experienced flyer, Tom Marshburn, who had flown shuttle Soyuz to space station for a long duration mission, and then on Dragon. And so he talks about that moment, but he remembers stepping back to watch us get our first views of Earth. And that was super meaningful for him to just like see, you know, these rookies who had trained up for this flight just experience that for the first time. And I think for all of us, our favorite memories of looking out the window throughout our entire mission were the ones where we were together. Like whenever we saw something really cool, we were always shouting like, hey, there's an awesome aurora, like just gathering everybody in the cupola, because I think experiencing that with your crewmates is just so magical.
Yeah, yeah. You've just spent a long time training with them. You have that bond. So speaking of training, you show up in the astronaut class of 2017. 4 years later, you're on orbit. So that's pretty darn impressive. So literally your first 4 years had to be nothing but training. So perhaps you could touch a little bit on what your ASCAN astronaut candidate training flow was like, how much station training you did as a part of that, and then what your mission training flow was like, because that was one of my technical assignments in the early 2000s. Was trying to figure out how to create the station training flow, and to do it when you had 5 space agencies participating. So how do we take a crew with all this potentially international travel that they need to do? How do we make this into a manageable training flow? And that was not a trivial issue.
Yeah, and it's not trivial in execution either. We have these amazing human beings called ITIs, or They're like, I think it's International Training Integrator is what that stands for. And they are in charge of making sure all of these pieces fit together. And it's incredibly complicated when our crews come together, especially because it seems like these days, just due to all the complications with the international agreement, sometimes the crews come together later and later, and it makes that challenge even harder. But our training really starts in that phase, our astronaut candidate phase, or ASCAN, the equivalent of being a plebe, but NASA style. And it's 2 years of basic astronaut training, essentially. And we have to demonstrate competency in 5 main areas that allow us to have a foundation where we can branch off and then be prepared to enter an assigned crew training flow for any mission, any station mission. So that includes basic spacewalk training, basic robotics training, T-38 flight training, Russian language training, and International Space Station training. During that time, we do get an opportunity to use some basic training with international partners, especially for robotics. We go to the Canadian Space Agency because they designed and help operate the robotic arm. And we try to visit our other international partners who have modules aboard the space station, whether that's the Japanese Space Agency, the European Space Agency. And we don't, during our candidate training, don't really get a chance to go to Russia to train with our Russian colleagues on a Russian segment training. So all of those, it really does take 2 years to get the class through that basic training and get them evaluated in all of those areas. And then we graduate and become astronauts who are assignable. And so it was a pretty quick turnaround for me from graduating in January to starting my training for Crew 3. And I think it's interesting how those things build. I think it's not dissimilar from our experiences in military training pipelines, where you kind of start with the building blocks and then you specialize further. So for me, Navy Nuclear Power School and Prototype, like learning the basics of how do you operate a nuclear reactor, and then you go to your boat and it's just that much more specific and operational to your mission set. So the specific nuclear reactor and then the specific ship driving skills for whatever mission you're going to go out and do. And so that's similar to what we do at NASA. Once we get assigned to our mission flow, we start training as a crew. So a big part of that is we're coming together with a new group of individuals. And so as opposed to individual training and evaluations, we're trying to figure out how are we going to actually approach this in real life as a crew? How are we going to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses and managing the resources across the crew in nominal and off-nominal situations? And so the thing we add in that we didn't have during our basic training is vehicle-specific training. So all of a sudden now we have to learn how to launch and come home in a certain spacecraft. And so for us, that was a SpaceX Dragon vehicle. So we were at SpaceX a lot, doing our training there at their simulator at their headquarters in Hawthorne, California. And we actually got to see our vehicle being built during our training flow too, because we took it on her maiden voyage, named our capsule Endurance. And so we were actually getting to watch it come together in the clean room and meet the technicians who were actually building our vehicle, which was really cool. And a lot of them actually are former military folks, usually from aviation, mechanics, stuff like that, who are then get out and come specialize in aerospace. So that's kind of a cool connection to the military too, meeting those folks. But altogether, it takes about 4 years if you put those back to back of the basic astronaut candidate training and then the crew training just to get us up to launch day. So a lot of that is the vehicle training, but to your point, a lot of it is the space station training, because the vehicle, that's the super dynamic phase of flight, really important. A lot can go right, a lot can go wrong, but really we're trying to go to the space station for 6 months to conduct a science mission. And so a lot of it is preparing us for the bulk of our mission, which is our 6 months as an expedition crew member.
So did that include training over to travel over to Japan to learn the GEM, the Japanese experiment module, and over to the European Space Agency for Columbus, which is their lab? So were you doing weeks over there to learn
Absolutely.
the lab facilities?
Typically, yes, that would be required, especially because we didn't have a Japanese astronaut on our crew. We needed GEM specialists Japanese module specialists who understand all the systems and equipment there. COVID made it really hard for us in a lot of cases, right? Because, talk about the ITI's job is hard pre-COVID. With all these COVID protocols, the travel restrictions, it was really challenging to go on these international trips because the requirements were constantly changing. And so I was a GEM specialist for our crew and did a ton of work in the Japanese module, and I have never been to Japan because they had a 2-week quarantine requirement. So we couldn't fit it into our training schedule. It's too packed that I would have to go sit in a hotel room for 2 weeks in Japan just to do 2 weeks of Japanese module training. So we actually did it remotely on Japanese hours. So I was working in like the evening into the, midnight, early hours of the morning to be with the instructors in their time zone. But we were able to go to the European Space Agency in Cologne and do our Columbus module training. And then we were required to go to Russia for our Russian module training or Russian segment training because all of our complex emergency response is integrated across those crews. So Houston and Moscow are working together, and we all have to understand and do the same procedures together. So a lot of that is just emergency training, and then some other nominal system training in case we ever need to assist with things. Like I helped suit up cosmonauts for spacewalks, so I learned a bit about their airlock, things like that. So yeah, we definitely try to get over to our international partners, and it's gotten a little bit better as COVID's gotten more under control, but that was a really challenging time to figure out how do we really certify these crews when we might not be able to go in person and do training as it was originally envisioned.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Like I said, space station training from the onset, we knew was going to be complicated. Just again, because of the international partner aspect, trying to do it during COVID. Yeah. So I take my hat off once again to the training division. Talk about the unsung heroes of the space program. They truly are. How they work their magic time and time again, beyond me, but they're always a great group to work with. So shifting gears a little bit, you're done with training, you climb in the vehicle, awesome launch, you get on orbit, as you said, it's all about heading to the space station. So you've already answered one of the questions I had. Your rendezvous timeline, about 24 hours. Shuttle. Some of this, I think, was just to give the crew a little bit of time on orbit, but it was, a very labor-intensive vehicle. This was my rendezvous checklist, all my procedures. You can see how thick it is. It took us about 44 hours to go through all of our systems, our orbital burns, all of our procedures to finally dock. And pretty intensive training flow, because again, very manual vehicle, have all our normal procedures, all our normal fly around type stuff, and then all our off-nominal stuff, literally the whole back is, what do we do in case we don't have a rendezvous radar or this component fails? So pretty intense. Crew Dragon being a highly automated vehicle, what was the training like for you to do rendezvous, and then what's that 24-hour period like?
Yeah, so the Dragon is capable of getting to the space station as short as 5 or 6 hours, actually. But our launch opportunities and kind of we call it flight day 1, 2, or 3, depending on when you're docking, those opportunities are driven by the exact station trajectory and then the appropriate time to launch for the weather. And we have instantaneous launch windows that make it really challenging. We've had a lot of people ask us recently, the Soyuz flights lately have gotten to the station in like 3-4 hours, so fast. And then the Dragon flights take longer. And it's hard to understand, I think, from the outside looking in why that is. But a lot of it has to do with how challenging it is to launch Dragon at these instantaneous windows with the weather. And so we don't always feel confident we're going to get it off the pad in that moment and that we might have to scrub. So we don't normally want to move the station trajectory to optimize our rendezvous time because we might waste propellant on that and then need it in a different place the next day. So usually for Russian launches, they're putting the station in an ideal orbit for the launch and rendezvous, as opposed to we're just kind of dealing with whatever we get for Dragon. And so that's why it often takes longer. But the training is, a nominal launch and docking for Dragon is pretty automated and or just controlled by the ground. So the crew doesn't really have to take any action in theory, as long as everything goes according to plan. And so we're just monitoring systems and making sure that we don't violate any safety boundaries. But we do have a manual piloting capability and other manual abort capability during launch, and then manual piloting during docking. So if for some reason the vehicle failed to perform as expected, we can take over and fly it ourselves. And so we do a lot of training to understand the nominal trajectory, but we spend a lot of time in those off nominal scenarios. I'm sure exactly like you guys did for shuttle, like the crazy minds of your trainers for the sims who thought up all of these, torturous failure modes and all of those things. So the folks at SpaceX do the same thing for us, kind of stack up these different failures that drive us to have to make decisions as a crew in coordination with the ground team on the best way to handle the situation. So yeah, we're kind of training in that same decision space, but the vehicle itself, if everything goes according to plan, kind of, flies itself and docks itself. Everything's automatic, but we have to be prepared for the eventuality that it might not be. So the pilot and commander seats, they do pretty significant training. The mission specialists that are in the two other seats, so I was in one of those mission specialist seats, we kind of join them for all their training starting about a year out from launch. But the 18, 24 months for them, they're already training and developing those skill sets so that they're ready no matter what happens.
Can any of that training be done at the Johnson Space Center on like a desktop simulator?
Yeah, so they do have a satellite training center with simulators in Houston near Johnson Space Center. So SpaceX has an office there where we're able to do some of our training, and it's kind of a display trainer with two flight lights, like seats. So it's like a flight simulator in some ways, but it's not the full capsule simulator. So I think as we continue to mature the program, we did do a lot of training here in Houston, but especially for all crew training, there is a lot of value for us being in the full mocked up capsule simulator, especially when all four of us are there. And so I think we'll balance that. Maybe eventually SpaceX will consider building a full simulator here, a full capsule simulator to make that a little bit easier for us. But there's I think we find a lot of value in going and traveling to SpaceX too, because we get to meet a broader team, and the interaction we have, like the folks I mentioned who are putting our vehicle together, that's really an important touch point for us, because they're also building cargo vehicles. And we really like to have that human connection. And the SpaceX leadership likes that too, a chance for us to go meet the people who are building and operating our rocket and capsule. And they look us in the eye and see like, oh, there's going to be a human butt in that seat. And like really take that seriously and maintain those connections, because it is a little bit different relationship than when NASA builds a rocket for us to fly. So we've really tried to embed as much as possible in the team. So even if we had more training capability here, I think the crew would still want to spend a significant amount of time at SpaceX if they could.
Oh yeah, and that to me is no different than what you saw during the shuttle program, where crews would go down to Kennedy regularly, because that was the team of people who were turning around your vehicle. And they were called OPF teams, orbital processing facility teams. And so they became, well, actually, they would look at the crew and say, "You are my family," and you form that bond. And you show up in person, and it's just a reminder of the importance of what they do and how critically important it is day in and day out for them to pay attention to the smallest detail. Because if they didn't, I mean, we were there in the flesh to remind them of, unfortunately, what the consequences could be if somebody's not paying attention that day. But that bond, I mean, every time we went down there, I just felt this huge, in some ways it was an actual physical embrace, but you just felt like the whole OPF team was coming together to embrace the crew, and you really became their family. And that was a very special bond. And it reminded you on crew walkout day of who you were really flying for. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about you. It was about that team, that group of people who poured their heart and soul into the program. So
absolutely. And I think because we've prioritized that on both sides of the relationship, I think the NASA SpaceX relationship is really high functioning of course, during development and test, we were really integrated the first couple of crews. But even now, it's cool to be there and meet all of the people. They have everybody in the same building, the engineers, they're building the rockets capsules in the same building. And so if you have a question, you can go talk to the person that designed the part. It's amazing how impactful those relationships are. And in many cases, even though they're constantly trying to evolve and improve. So there was a couple of times during our training where we identified issues with the procedures where they weren't quite clear, or what it said in words is not what they meant for you to do, or whatever. And the SpaceX trainers will be on Slack to the person who owns and rates the procedure, and in 10 minutes they'll be up there, just coming up with ideas on how to improve it, and it'll be implemented in the flight software the next day for you to evaluate it. And so just like seeing that kind of cooperation, it's just it's an awesome relationship. And I think it allowed us to build a lot of trust with that team.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear all of that. So I have to highlight the fact that you're one of only 2 individuals from the submarine community to be selected as astronauts. And I am thrilled to see that Steve Bowen, class of 86 from the Naval Academy, another one of those Naval Academy astronauts, is going to get his chance to do a long duration flight on station, replacing Nicole Mann, class of 99, who's on board right now. But Kayla, people are going to want to know this. Submarine officer, submarine deployments. Steve and I would talk regularly, why aren't there more submariners? It's just such a relevant, equivalent environment. So how did your sub deployments prepare you for your 6-month stint on station?
So well. The connections between the submarine force and the space station are actually what inspired me to apply in the first place. I don't think I ever had there must have been some mental block or barrier for me to imagine myself becoming an astronaut, because I was always inspired by the space program, but it never occurred to me that was something I could do until I served on my submarine and met your classmate, Kay Heyer, when I was back working at the Naval Academy during my shore tour. And she was telling me about her shuttle mission where they brought up a space station module in the payload bay of the shuttle, and all these engineering challenges they ran into, and what it was like up there, and what kind of team they needed to succeed and overcome that. And it was this click in my head that I just went, the space station's a submarine in space. Mm-hmm. And Kay was like, it absolutely is. And I was obsessed after that moment. It's like whatever that mental barrier was dropped. And I was like, could I be an astronaut? Could I actually do that? And I think my time in the submarine force allowed me to understand the kind of team it took to operate in such a complex environment where people aren't meant to be living, working, and doing anything of importance, under the depths of the ocean or in the vacuum of space. And so it takes the same kind of equipment, the same kind of mindset, and especially the same kind of people, because these machines are so complicated. No one person can understand everything you need to know to make that vehicle work, and especially to make decisions when things aren't going according to plan. And so you need the same kind of leadership and team climate to bring in the inputs from the experts and synthesize information really quickly, make a decision, and go with it, keep the team on the same page. And so I think all of those things allowed me to imagine myself even serving in that role. And then when I got into training and eventually into flight, I relied on that experience just instinctively, because every single challenge we face, whether we're trying to execute a science experiment and it's a little bit different than they expected on the ground because they didn't anticipate something about the microgravity environment, and you just have to problem solve. And no one person can know everything. But it was really fascinating to apply that same sort of critical thinking, the same, communication skills, how to ask the right questions, how to speak in a very precise manner. So you can't just say like, oh, the thing's not working. Like usually the ground team can't even see what you're looking at. So you have to, it's similar to the submarine force when you're talking to, the engine room to control or something like that, you're not always looking at the same information. And so how to bring the team together around these complex challenges is so similar. And so I think for me, I always fell back on my experience in the submarine force and the coalition building around solving a problem. every single day relied on those experiences in order to succeed on orbit.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear. And I hope you have an opportunity to go back and talk to your colleagues in the sub community right now and give them that sort of feedback, that they prepared you quite well for your challenges just a few hundred miles higher up. So here's another question that maybe it's a little bit stereotypical, since we all assume, for those of us in other communities, we all assume that the submarine community has the best food. So just curious, who has the better food? Sub station.
I would say probably a submarine, because we have people, amazing cooks on submarines, which is why the food's so good, because they have the same raw materials, but the cooks are incredible. And watching the mentorship and knowledge, the skill passed down from, a CSC, a culinary specialist chief, down to the new sailors on the boat, and the things they're able to create out of, these crazy ingredients and limited resources, limited supply unloads, are amazing. And I think there's something really special about a member of your team, like, lovingly preparing a meal for you. It's just like, that's so nice. But I think space food is actually surprisingly good. Like, I was kind of worried about it. I wasn't sure what it would be like. And you go to these food tastings before you launch, but it's kind of like, I think any expeditionary thing you do, the food always tastes better when you're actually doing the thing. Like when you're camping or whatever, like if you ate that food at home, you'd be like, oh, this is kind of lame. But when you're camping, you're like, this is amazing. It's the best thing I've ever eaten. So I think space, it can kind of be that way too. And it's an interesting mix of sort of the exact same food from MREs. So I was used to some of those dishes from my time training at the Naval Academy. NASA created food in our own food lab that's dehydrated. We add water back and then heat it up. Or canned food. A lot of the international partner food is canned. Mm-hmm. And so you get, I think the biggest thing, and this is similar to a submarine, I think what kind of gets to you is just lack of variety, because you can't just have a craving and order food delivered to your door or go out to, whatever is on your mind that day. You just have what you have and you have to make it work. So we tried to get really creative with different food combinations. And we always had a family dinner on Friday. And it was really important to me and Raja, especially, I think, that we had a shared meal, that it wasn't just people picking their own food, that it had a theme and it was sort of family style. And so we were making the most creative combinations of foods to kind of just have a different theme every week for a family dinner. But I actually really enjoyed the food up there. It wasn't terrible. It was actually really good and pretty nutritious. So no complaints about the food in either place.
Oh, God bless you. Again, back to a technical assignment. I directly and indirectly supported the first 14 expeditions crews flying on station, and biggest complaint, food. I didn't get my food. I got somebody else's food. And finally, we just look, guys, we're never going to get you your food, because we just cannot sync resupply vehicles with launch delays to when you're on orbit. So we're going to just do a standard menu, and then you can spice it up with your bonus food container. But I'm tired, and the food community is tired of listening to you all complain about food. So I'm glad to hear you say that you had enjoyed it. So back to on-orbit operations. Is there a typical day on station, or is every day just an amazing variety of tasks and science experiments to accomplish, so you never feel like you're in a rut?
It's a little bit of both. There's kind of a rhythm to a normal work week, normal work day, where every morning, we usually got up between 6 and 6:30. I did, at least. Morning person. Like to have a good breakfast before I start my day. But at 7:30, and we're on GMT time, so Zulu time, just to kind of even out, the control centers across the world are all on their local times. But at 7:30 GMT, we have a morning planning conference where all the control centers come together to talk to the crew about the plan for the day. And then that wraps up in about 10, 15 minutes, and then we're off and running, usually working individually, sometimes in pairs. But you could be doing any number of things, primarily executing science experiments, but also just maintaining the station, either because something broke and you have to fix it, constantly fixing the toilet or the treadmill or whatever it is to just kind of keep the world going around, or preventative maintenance, just to make sure, you know, anything on sort of these routine bases like we're used to from our underway time in the Navy. And so you can kind of get a mix of things, but it depends. Our flight kind of felt like it had sort of seasons or surges for certain things. And we actually felt pretty lucky for that because we had something to focus on. And then we had a little bit of a recovery time. And just as we started to get bored, we'd search for something else. So when we first got up there, we were getting ready for the first spacewalk of our mission. And so we were getting the suits, the tools ready, preparing, you know, studying our procedures. And so that was the big focus for the first 3 weeks or so, just getting out the door to do a spacewalk. And then we had a bit of a lull. Then we had a SpaceX cargo vehicle come. And so that kicks off a major science campaign because that vehicle returns to the ground with cargo. And so a lot of the science experiments have to be executed and put back on the vehicle to return home. And so you're really under the gun for a lot of these experiments, trying to get them all accomplished in time. And then we got a little recovery. Then we had a Cygnus vehicle come and we're doing cargo operations for that. And then towards the end of our mission, we had 2 spacewalks, the private astronaut mission, Axiom 1, and then Crew 4 arrive. And so we kind of had these like surges and then lulls to recover. And that kind of drove along that daily schedule, you know, sort of 7:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. workday, and some, you know, cleaning on the weekends. We do housekeeping tasks and just kind of get ready for the next week. There were times where we were pretty stretched, and then times where we're kind of like twiddling our thumbs a little bit, looking for extra stuff to do. And so it was kind of perfect because we were never ran out of reserve and always had a focus, and then had, you know, time to rest and recover in between.
Yeah, well, that, you know, as we were beginning to put together station and timelines, you know, it was challenging because people came from that shuttle mentality where literally you got to make every minute count. You're on orbit for a short period of time. So, you know, you'd have a daily timeline that would look like this. Literally every moment of the day is scripted for you. And you always felt like you were perpetually behind. And you know, it just kept looking at, well, that's where the shuttle mirror program came in to be, just a handful of NASA astronauts that we were able to fly on it. They were very valuable in terms of, this is a marathon, a long duration flight is a marathon, shuttle was a sprint, this is a marathon, you have to change that mindset. So it's going to be critically important to let the crew have some pacing, some rest time. They need a weekend. Ooh, weekend, what's that? Literally, to quote Downton Abbey, it's a weekend. Well, we didn't have one in the shuttle program, but station, it was clear that the mindset and the approach had to change.
Yeah, we actually, so one thing that was interesting about our mission is we were there for the second half of Mark Vande Hey's record-setting 355-day mission. So he holds the longest continuous space flight record for an American now. And so we were there for the second half of his mission. And so talk about a marathon. His mindset was even more about maintaining that reserve, you know, really focusing on self-care, staying connected with his family, all of these things. And so I actually think he was a really good model for us about maintaining those boundaries, because I think, especially when you first get up there, the crew's really gung-ho. And so when ground's like, do you guys want to work on Saturday? And they're like, well, sure. And Mark would be like, no, we're not working on Saturday. And so he was like, are you telling me to work on Saturday? Because if you're asking if we want to, the answer is no, we don't want to work on the weekend. And so I think that set a really good example for us that we were grateful for as we got into the mission, because it is really easy to get burnt out. And we do have, you know, electronic version of the timeline you showed now. And there's a literal red line that like marches across the day. You're scheduled down to 5-minute increments. And it is really easy to feel like you're behind and get really stressed out. But our crew definitely approached each day as a team challenge, even if we were working individually. So if you ever had a spare moment, you were first looking to see how you could support a crewmate. And nobody was done for the day until the crew was done. I'm sure it was the same in shuttle, where you guys kind of jumped on a problem to help people succeed. And so I think those things together, that kind of crew culture, helped us, you know, stay grounded about like, you never know how the day is going to go. Sometimes everything goes perfectly and it's like you finish a 2-hour task in an hour and a half and you feel like a hero. And then the next day you have like, you're an hour over because you lost the only torque wrench and like nothing fits together. Exactly. And it just like, you can never predict how a day is going to go when you start. So you always have these high hopes that you'll stay in front of the red line, but usually you end up getting behind and need help from a friend to make it through the day.
Yep. Yeah, well, you know, to quote life at the Naval Academy, cooperate to graduate.
Exactly. That's exactly what you need to do up there.
All right, well, I'm looking at the time. So Jimmy and Sophie, I know you mentioned questions. Should we transition over to questions?
Yes, I have a few. Yeah, thank you
Yes,
guys.
ma'am.
This has been unbelievably great to hear. You guys kind of touched on the beginning just about the training and the rigorous, you know, things you have to go through just to launch. But, you know, was there anything that surprised you once you got through all that training, you're launched, you're in the space station or in the shuttle? Was there anything that said, "Oh my gosh, this is surprising"? There was something, or an aha moment, or other than just seeing that beautiful view?
I'm going to have to say, I like to answer that question this way. First off, the power of the rocket, as there was no simulator on Earth that was going to simulate 6.5 million pounds of thrust, because that's what the shuttle generated. It literally was an elephant sitting on your chest. They're like, okay, this is more dynamic than the simulator and the centrifuge, but hey, riding the rocket's pretty cool and pretty fun. And then really trying to figure out how to move around in a weightless environment and do it in a somewhat coordinated way. I was pretty uncoordinated. I called it flying ugly for about 24 hours. And I would say to my former physics students, you don't really understand the concept of center of mass and how forces react through center of mass when you're finally in that situation on orbit and you're trying to figure out how to move around. First time I did it, I did not consider everything going through center of mass. So basically I just went tumbling across the midday. That was my aha moment. Like, oh yeah, everything through center of mass. Center of mass probably right about here. So don't push off like that. Push off like this. So those were probably my two big aha moments.
Yeah, I think for me, I wasn't totally prepared for the emotional experience of launch in particular. Like, I did tell you guys earlier that like you could have tricked us and told us we're in the simulator, and overall that's true. But for me, when we finally hit our terminal count, you know, the famous like 10, 9, 8, and the rocket lights, you feel that thrust building. There's kind of this magical moment where you feel yourself lifting off the pad, but you haven't quite started accelerating yet. And I just felt this moment where it felt like we were hanging there on this precipice, like you're for sure going. There's no turning back. You feel the thrust underneath you. And I was just flooded with the purest emotion I've ever had of just joy and excitement, like the least complicated feeling I've ever experienced. And I was just so pumped, cried a few tears of joy, and then got back to monitoring systems. And so I think for me, you can't anticipate how that's going to feel. And I think my family watching from the stands, like they were having a much more complicated emotional experience watching the launch.
Oh yeah, they do.
Experiencing it. But I think that was really incredible. And then I think the other thing I like knew would be amazing, but didn't quite anticipate is just the bonds you form with your crewmates. It's just such a unique experience. And the only people that can really understand it are the people who are there with you on that crew, because every mission is different. Every day is different. And so I think our crew was super tight, and we really supported each other in a really special way. So I think that was just incredible. And I think totally something I'll carry with me forever, how important those relationships are.
And Kayla, you were mentioning, you know, not having the dreams of being an astronaut until, you know, somebody came to you and said, you could do it. And I was, you know, followed you on Instagram, and the videos you would do, like, you know, washing your hair, exercising in space. I took that as, I think it's cool to see that, but it's also inspiring maybe to the next generation of potential astronauts. Is that something you guys take responsibility? I know, Wendy, you've been a great mentor for a lot of folks, but is that something you guys take, you know, as a responsibility to be that mentor, be that inspiration to the next generation?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've looked up to Wendy forever, even before I dreamed of becoming an astronaut, but especially once I had that dream, you know, I hope that I can do the same thing for the next generation, just like be an authentic human being. You know, astronauts have amazing jobs, but we're regular people. And I think like just not losing sight of that. We're like regular people who have worked hard and have had amazing mentors and family, coaches, teachers who have shaped us and believed in us along the way. And so I think social media is an interesting opportunity to share these journeys with people who otherwise wouldn't have access to that experience. And so I tried to just show what it was really like up there, you know, not just like through all the, you know, kind of like a no filter version of what it's like to live and work in space, because I think it's hard to wrap your head around what that's really like, but humanizing that experience, you know, the little things like how do you eat? How do you wash your hair? How do you move around? How do you exercise? How do you go to the bathroom? All of these things, I think, help it be more relatable, even though it's so unimaginable. You know, it's unimaginable for me really until I did it myself. But I think seeing those things helps people understand that you're just like a human doing an incredible thing, as opposed to an incredible human doing, you know, like I think that's just helps people wrap their head around what it's like to be up there.
Yeah, I mean, because they're doing those very same activities. So as you said, they can relate to that. Yeah, I got to wash my hair, you know, and they have to wash clothes as well. So not something we've quite perfected to do on the station yet. I know NASA's working on it, but we've had some creative astronauts who are literally, you want to see me wash my clothes? I take a Ziploc, put some soap in it, and go. But Kayla, I think I've seen you back at the academy, and I've seen a whole flock of midshipmen around you. So you being a much more recent grad, the mids gravitate to you because you weren't there all that long ago. I mean, you were there not all that long ago. And so, they're like, you look like me. Now I can see myself doing that very same thing. So again, that relatability is critically important. And you're already off on a good start.
Did you have any?
Yeah, do you both have any advice for younger generations? I know I'm teaching NE 203, 14 youngsters right now, and at this moment in time, I think they're just trying to understand why they're there at the Naval Academy and what their mission is. And do you have anything to offer them as far as advice? And also our younger generations that are out there that are going to watch this recording.
Okay, just to excuse my ignorance now, but 203 is what now? Naval Engineering 203?
No, it's ethics.
Oh, ethics. Oh, excuse me. NL. Well, that's a critically important topic. Kayla, I'll let you start since you are still on active duty.
Yeah, you know, as I mentioned, I never envisioned that I would be, you know, celebrating a 1-year anniversary of my space flight. You know, as a kid or even as a midshipman, I was never imagining myself doing those things. And along the way, I think I've learned, even though I'm a planner and I would like to be able to chart every step of my journey and know what that looks like and therefore know what the right decision is to make right now, I've learned that every experience I've had, the new relationships I've formed with peers and mentors has changed what I think I'm capable of, what I'm drawn to along the way. And so I think even back in high school, when I was deciding if I wanted to go to the Naval Academy, I started asking myself sort of 3 questions that have guided all of these major decisions, like what service assignment I wanted, whether I wanted to be an astronaut, all of these things. And I think, so for me, those questions are like, what am I really passionate about? You know, I know I want to go do hard things, but what do I really care about? Because that's how I'm going to end up having fun and learning along the way, even though I'm challenging myself. So what do I really believe in? What do I want to dedicate myself to? What do I want to be a part of? What will be the most challenging thing I can do? What's going to be the most developmental? You know, because I know I don't have all of the skills, abilities, perspectives I need right now to do what I want to do in the future. And so what can I challenge myself to learn and grow? That of course is in line with that passion. And then the final thing that I think has been the most important for me is, who do I want standing next to me when things are hard? Who's my team? because if I'm going to go chase those challenges and I really care about what I'm doing, I'm going to need people who hold me accountable, who support my growth, who turn, stumbles into opportunities to learn and do better next time, as opposed to falling on my face. And so I found that team, at the Naval Academy and as a subset on my sports teams running cross country and track. I found that in the submarine force with my crew. I found that here at NASA. These, the people who are standing next to you are the most important thing, I think, for how you turn those opportunities into opportunities to contribute. And so I think those have been guiding and clarifying questions for me when it feels like, what do I do next? You feel kind of lost. If I ask myself those questions, it always sort of comes into focus for me.
Yep. To your point about that, Kayla, I like to call that the support system. And I think that's one thing that became really clear to me at the Naval Academy. And for me, it was in the form of the crew team. But it's a challenging environment by design. And I think unfortunately, in the United States, we instill this mindset in people that you've got to do everything on your own. You've got to pull yourself up by your bootstrap, which I really think does a disservice to everybody, because nobody does everything on their own. And so you need that support system. Also, like I call it kind of your group of cheerleaders, those folks that you want to have around you, who are going to rally around you, who are going to pick you up when you're down. Having a dream for 25 years is not easy. It can be exhausting. And yeah, along the way, there were a lot of ups and downs and periods where just naturally you're going to be low on energy. And so you need to have that group of people who are going to pick you back up, be willing to walk with you for a period of time, cheer you up, pat you on the head, pat you on the back, keep you pointed in that direction. The other thing I would say to midshipmen right now is there is nothing wrong with asking for help. And I put my former instructor hat on. I spent a lot of time doing extra instruction for physics. There's nothing wrong in going for extra instruction or going over to the academic center for study skills prep. And to me, that's not a sign of weakness. I mean, again, in America, I think we instill in people that if you ask for help, then somehow you're not as good as somebody else, or it's a sign of weakness. No, for me, that's an indication that you care about what you're doing, you want to do a better job at it, you have the self-awareness at that period of time to know that this is an area that is challenging for you, and you have that inner strength to do something uncomfortable, which may be asking for help, going one-on-one to your instructor or in the EI group. But to me, that is the sign of strength. So I'd say to the mids right now, nothing wrong with asking for help. Again, by design, the Naval Academy is challenging. The Navy is challenging. Don't attempt to do everything on your own. Go find that support system. Go find that team and work really hard to be a good teammate to others as well. So be a good shipmate.
Wonderful, wonderful advice.
I think that's a great way to end this. Unless you have anything else you want to share, this has been a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you both for taking the time and sharing your experiences with our community. And to everybody who's going to see this recording, we appreciate you tuning in, and we hope you have a great night. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And
Yeah,
Kayla, congratulations on your 1-year anniversary. Go celebrate.
Thank you, ma'am.
Congratulations. Thank you.
All right.